Hello everybody and welcome to our second video in our series of videos on international relations between 1945 up to the present day. Today we are going to be looking at the Korean War, which happened between 1950 and 1953. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know what caused the Korean War. Second, you guys should be able to name 4 to 5 key points in the Korean War. And third, you guys should know the results of the Korean War. So as we looked at in our last video, the tensions between the superpowers of the USSR and the USA had already manifested in the Berlin blockade of 1948 and 1949. Remember, the US was continuing a policy of containment against the spread of communism. To do this, they offered military aid in the form of the Truman policy and economic aid in Europe as part of the Marshall Plan. The next phase of the battle between the communist and capitalist countries of the USSR and the USA took place in Korea, which is marked here. It would be a peninsula off of China, and you can see its closeness to Japan as well. And Korea was actually ruled by Japan between 1910 and 1945. At the end of World War II, Korea was taken over by the Allies, and it was divided into two zones. The Soviets occupied the north part of the peninsula, whereas the US troops occupied the southern half of the peninsula. And the country was divided along a line, as you can see in the middle there, called the 38th parallel. In 1948, so 3 years after World War II, the UN, which had, remember, replaced the League of Nations, called for free elections in the country of Korea. But they only happened in the south. North Korea were unhappy that South Korea was having its own separate election from North Korea. They wanted an election for the entire country, so they refused to participate in the elections at this time. This led to a division of North and South Korea ruling themselves. North Korea was led by a communist leader known as Kim Il-sung, pictured on the left, and South Korea was led by a man named Syngman Rhee, and it called itself the Republic of Korea. The US was strongly involved in the establishment of South Korea. This was part of their containment policy, as we've already seen. South Korea, it was unstable economically when it was trying to get itself back on its feet after Japanese imperial rule, and the United States, they feared that South Korea would fall to communism, so they gave them economic aid. They also helped to build up the South Korean military, which is part of the Truman Doctrine, to give the military funding and aid. However, after the elections, it was agreed that the US and the USSR would withdraw troops from Korea in 1949. This then led to North Korea invading South Korea on the 25th of June 1950. So this map underneath us, the first map on the left, shows the division of North Korea along the 38th parallel. So the North Koreans crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. By September of 1940, you can see that North Korea had taken almost the entirety of South Korea, and the South Koreans were pushed into the tiny corner there in the left. Established at Busan was the main city that they still held on to. The UN reaction to this was quite quick. In June the 27th, the UN Security Council labelled North Korea as the aggressor, and they offered support to South Korea. This resolution was sponsored by the US and got passed very quickly. So in September of 1950, UN forces that were made up mainly of US troops, because the US were the people really pushing this policy, they entered South Korea under the direction of General MacArthur. He landed troops here at INCHON, and they took the capital of Seoul, forcing the North Koreans to retreat. However, MacArthur, he pushed past the 38th parallel, and he pushed into North Korea, and he headed for the Yalu River on the Chinese border. And you can see that in our third map here. By November the 25th, the UN forces are nearly nearly taken all the peninsula and are approaching Chinese territory. China had a communist revolution after World War II, and it became a communist country in 1949 under the leadership of this man here, Chairman Mao. It caused a lot of anxiety within America that China, such a large country, had become communist. China felt under threat from the US troops on their border, and China then gave aid to North Korea in late November to push back the UN forces. This led to General MacArthur saying that he wanted a major expansion of the war and he wanted to attack China. With this counterattack aided by the Chinese, the North Koreans were able to push the UN and US forces back to roughly the 38th parallel. You can see in this final map here, roughly where these troops were facing off against each other. In April of 1951, MacArthur was dismissed. He had given public interviews in which he said Truman's policy was wrong, that they should bomb China, and that he was calling for nuclear bombs to be dropped on China and for an invasion of China and a blockade of Chinese ports to happen, which really escalated tensions with China and led to Truman sacking him in April of 1951. The war had really reached a stalemate by the summer of 1951. As you can see there, it kind of settled in or around the 38th parallel. There was fighting, but no major battles happened between 51 and 53. Things then began to change that could bring about peace. Dwight D. Eisenhower, one of the heroes of World War II, became US president in 1952, and he had promised to end the Korean War, but still to resist the spread of communism. He was elected, and he stayed true to his word to end the war. One of the big things that happened that allowed this to happen was that on March of 1953, Stalin died, and the US felt that they could get a better deal now that Stalin was gone, and they felt that the Soviet Union mightn't be in as good a place to negotiate. So they actually increased bombing in North Korea in May of 1953 to try get a better deal for the South Koreans. Eventually, on July 27, 1953, an armistice or kind of a halt to the fighting was agreed upon between the two countries. The main results then of the Korean War was that the UN had showed that it wasn't weak like the League of Nations, and the UN to this day is still a very powerful organization in international relations, and it really flexed its muscles here at the Korean War. The second thing is there is a continued division of the Korean Peninsula to this day, and finally, this encouraged the US to continue its policy of containment. They tried to contain communism in Southeast Asia, to keep it within Japan and China and North Korea. This led to an alliance with Japan, who had been their mortal enemies only 5 years earlier, and this would eventually get the US dragged into the Vietnam War. So you guys should now know what caused the Korean War. So the establishment of two separate governments in North and South Korea, and the North Korean invasion of South Korea. You guys should be able to name 4 to 5 key points in the Korean War. So that would be the North Koreans pushing the South Koreans down into Busan, General MacArthur landing at INCHON, pushing the North Koreans back up towards the Yalu River, China intervening, MacArthur being dismissed. These are all key points in the Korean War. And finally, you guys should know some of the results of the Korean War. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys got something good from this video.